Capital punishment for murder was effectively abolished in England in 1965, except for treason, which ceased in 1998. Before that, people from all walks of life were hanged for all manner of reasons, often in cases that we may consider unjust today. If there was ever going to be justice in hanging anybody, then the case of George Smith, the infamous brides-in-the-bar serial killer and bigamist who murdered 3 women, would probably be near the top of the list. When the police finally caught up with him concerning a number of suspicious deaths, they discovered a trail of deception, deceit, and 3 dead wives. George Joseph Smith was born in the London borough of Bethnal Green on the 11th of January 1872, the son of an insurance agent. At age 9, he was sent to a reform school in Gravesend in Kent, as he was an unruly and difficult child. He was a cold, heartless man, but loved a woman called Edith Pegler. His feelings for her, if they genuinely existed, paled into the background over his desire for money. He was lazy and would not work hard to earn a living, but he did possess a special quality that enabled him to get it, as he had a way to charm women. One of them, whom he bigamously married, and luckily for her survived his murderous ways, said, "The power lay in his eyes." Having served jail time for stealing and receiving stolen property, he married Caroline Thornhill in 1898, and this turned out to be his only legal marriage. She was 18, and naively might have thought she was marrying a prosperous businessman by the name of George Love, who owned a bread shop. When he went bankrupt, Smith sent his wife to work as a maid, prompting her to steal her employer's jewellery and silver along the way. They lived and worked in London, then moved to Brighton and Eastbourne to fleece more well-to-do households. All went well for them until the day Caroline, at her husband's behest, tried to pawn some stolen jewellery and was arrested when the suspicious pawnbroker called the police. She went to prison for a year, while Smith hurriedly disappeared from sight. But Caroline got her revenge. When she was released, she saw Smith, her lawful husband, by chance one day, and called the police. He was caught, and she testified against him. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison. He may have sought revenge in return when he was released, but he never got the chance, as his wife migrated to Canada to make a new start. But they remained a married couple. Smith went on to bigamously marry a string of women, always for their money. There were a total of 7 of these marriages. He would either persuade them to hand over their assets to him, usually saying it was for a business venture, or insure their lives. Once he had what he wanted, he would simply disappear, leaving victims with broken hearts and empty bank accounts, or, in 3 cases, dead. In August 1910, Smith, then 38, married Bessie Munday, a woman in her mid-30s. Smith, calling himself Henry Williams, married her for the sum of £2,500 she inherited from her father upon his death. But Smith was unable to get his hands on the money, as it had been placed into the hands of trustees. He persuaded her to hand over £150 in cash, then left her, accusing her of infecting him with venereal disease. He broke her heart, but he just couldn't get the thought of the £2,500 from his mind. By chance, 18 months later, when Bessie was walking men on holiday in the seaside resort of Weston-super-Mare in Somerset, spotted her husband and stopped him on the beach to have a talk. The outcome of the conversation was that she readily forgave him and believed his explanation that having contracted VD, as he thought, he considered it best to leave rather than pass it on to her. He claimed that since he missed her, he had since searched for her everywhere and now wanted a reconciliation between the both of them. Thrilled at the prospect of having her husband back and not be an abandoned woman, Bessie took him back to where she was staying, at Williams's, or rather Smith's, suggestion. They both drew up mutual wills, where each would benefit in the event of the other's death. This meant that Smith would inherit the coveted £2,500, while his wife would get nothing, for her so-called husband had nothing to leave her. Unwittingly, Bessie had put herself in peril. Smith, alias Henry Williams, with Bessie, moved to 10 High Street in the Kent town of Herne Bay, having previously married in 1910 in Weymouth. He set himself up as an art dealer, complete with a brass plate with his name on it, mounted on the front door. He also bought a new bath for their new home, which Bessie helped him choose. He took her to see a Dr. Frank French, explained that his wife was having fits, even though they were just mild headaches, and she was prescribed some medication. But in reality, he was laying the foundations for what was to follow. That is, that the doctor would not be surprised if Mrs. Williams should happen to drown while having a fit in her bath. The following day, the doctor was summoned as Smith said that his wife was taken ill again. He checked on her and promised to come back the following afternoon. He was surprised when, on the following morning, he was sent a note by Williams that his wife had died of drowning and could he come immediately. The doctor found Bessie in the tub, her head under water, her legs stretched out straight, and her feet protruding out of the water. There was no trace of violence, so French attributed the drowning to epilepsy. Her husband said he had popped out to buy food, and when he returned, he found her dead. The coroner's jury awarded Williams the amount of £2,579, 13 shillings and 7 pence, as stipulated in Mrs. Williams' will, made 5 days before her death. She was buried in a pauper's grave, and Smith collected the cash. Just over a year later, in November 1913, Smith married nurse Alice Burnham, aged 25. Soon afterwards, he persuaded her to make her will in his favour. They went to Blackpool on their honeymoon and found accommodation, with a bathroom, at a Mrs. Crossley's. As before, Smith's new wife had cause to see a doctor, and one morning, having gone out to buy some eggs, Smith returned to find his wife dead in the bath, having first ensured the landlady was aware of his visit to the shop. A doctor was called, but found nothing suspicious. Another pauper's burial followed, and this time Smith inherited £600. In December 1914, after more marriages and relieving his wives of their savings, Smith, now posing as an estate agent called John Lloyd, married his third murder victim, Margaret Lofty, in Bath in the west of England, an appropriately named city, bearing in mind what was to happen. Margaret would be dead the very next day. The newlywed couple had travelled to London after the wedding and lodged in rooms in Highgate. The landlady would later testify that she heard the sound of splashing upstairs, followed by a sigh, followed by loud music coming from the sitting room, designed to give the impression that there was someone there all of the time. Smith had left the house, returning soon after saying he bought some tomatoes for supper. He rang the front doorbell to be let into the house, even though he had a key. Upstairs he discovered the drowned body of his wife. Again there was a pauper's funeral, and again Smith sought to cash in, this time by claiming an insurance policy, but was delayed owing to the inquest being adjourned through a witness being ill. Smith had married many women and murdered 3, but with the murder of Margaret Lofty his number was up. He wasn't careless, as it was purely by chance, and was due to a story in the news of the world. Strange deaths at seaside resorts were of interest only to the local press, and were read about by local people, but a bride drowning in her bath in London featured in a national newspaper, and was read about all over the country by readers like Charles Burnham, Alice Burnham's father, and William Haynes in Blackpool, who lived near to Mrs. Crossley's boarding house, where Alice was murdered. The husbands involved had different names, but in each case were recently married, and in each case the husband had discovered their wives dead in the bath. In January 1915, Detective Inspector Arthur Neal of the Metropolitan Police received a letter from Joseph Crossley, who owned a boarding house in Blackpool. Including with the letter were 2 newspaper clippings. One was from the News of the World, dated before Christmas 1914, about the death of Margaret Lofty, aged 38, who died in her lodgings at 14 Bismarck Road in Highgate. She was found in her bathtub by her husband, John Lloyd, and their landlady. The other clipping contained the report of a Blackpool coroner's inquest, dated the 13th of December 1913, concerning a woman named Alice Burnham, who had died suddenly in a boarding house while in her bathtub. She was found by her husband, George Smith. Alice was not an heiress, but had worked hard and saved money. Smith took out a life insurance policy on his wife worth £500. The letter, dated the 3rd of January, was written by Crossley on behalf of his wife and Mr. Charles Burnham, who both expressed their suspicion on the striking similarity of the 2 incidents and urged the police to investigate the matter. Neal visited 14 Bismarck Road, where the Lloyds had taken lodgings, and found it hard to believe that an adult like Mrs. Lloyd could have drowned in such a small bathtub, especially since it was 3/4 full when she was found. He then interviewed the coroner, Dr. Bates, and asked whether there were signs of violence on the woman. None was seen except a tiny bruise above the left elbow. Looking into it further, on further investigation, Neal learned that a will had been made on the 18th of December 1914, which made her husband John the sole beneficiary. John had submitted the new will to a lawyer for settlement. It was discovered that Mrs. Lloyd had withdrawn all her savings on the very same day. On the 12th of January, Dr. Bates called Neal with an inquiry from the Yorkshire Insurance Company regarding the death of Mrs. Lloyd. 3 days before she was married, she had taken out a life insurance policy for £700 with her husband as the sole beneficiary. Neal requested that the doctor to delay his reply. At the same time, Neal requested more information on the Smith case from the Blackpool police. It came out that the late Mrs. Smith had earlier taken out a life insurance policy and made a will in her husband's favour, and she took the lodgings in Blackpool only after her husband inspected the bath at the property. Neil asked Dr. Bates to issue a favourable report to the insurance company. He was counting on the suspect getting in touch with his lawyer in order to collect the insurance payout, and the office was watched day and night. On the 1st of February, a man fitting Lloyd's description appeared. Neil introduced himself and asked him whether he was John Lloyd. After Lloyd answered in the affirmative, Neil then asked him whether he was also George Smith. The man denied it vehemently. Neil, already sure that Lloyd and Smith were the same man, told him that he would take him in for questioning on suspicion of bigamy, whereby the man finally admitted that he was indeed Smith and was arrested for using a false name when he got married to Margaret. Even though Smith was now in custody, Inspector Neil still needed proof that the crimes went beyond marital fraud. He was hoping to now find it, and Margaret Lofty was exhumed for another autopsy. Neil's current theory was that Alice and Margaret were poisoned, not drowned, and then staged in the baths. When Smith was arrested for the charge of bigamy and suspicion of murder, the pathologist Bernard Spilsbury was asked to determine how the women died. Although he was based at the Home Office and acted mainly in a consulting capacity, Spilsbury was also available for direct assistance to the police force. Margaret Lloyd's body was exhumed, and Spilsbury's first task was to confirm drowning as the cause of death, and if so, whether by accident or by force. He confirmed the tiny bruise on the elbow as noted before, as well as 2 microscopic marks. Even the evidence of drowning was not extensive. There were no signs of heart or circulatory disease, but the evidence suggested that death was almost instantaneous, as if the victim died of a sudden stroke. Poison was also seen as a possibility, and Spilsbury ordered tests on their presence. Finally, he proposed to Neil that they run some experiments in the very same bathtub in which Mrs. Lloyd died. Neil had it set up in the police station. Newspaper reports about the brides in the bath began to appear. On the 8th of February, a police officer based at the seaside resort of Herne Bay in Kent had read the stories and sent Neil a report of another death which was strikingly similar to the other 2. It was concerning the death of newlywed Bessie Munday. Neil sent photographs of Smith to Herne Bay for possible identification, and then went to Blackpool, where Spilsbury was conducting an autopsy of Alice Smith. The results were the same as with Margaret Lloyd: the lack of violence, every suggestion of instantaneous death, and little evidence of drowning. Furthermore, there were no traces of poison on Margaret Lloyd. Baffled, Spilsbury routinely took measurements of the corpse and had the bath sent to London. Neil had received confirmation from Herne Bay. Henry Williams was also John Lloyd and George Smith. This time, when Spilsbury examined Bessie Williams, he found one sure sign of drowning, which was the presence of goosebumps on the skin of her thigh. As with the other 2 deaths, the bath in which Mrs. Williams had died was sent to London. For weeks, Spilsbury pondered over the baths and the victim's measurements. The first stage of an epileptic seizure consists of a stiffening and extension of the entire body. Considering Bessie Williams' height of 5 feet 7 inches and the length of the bath, which was 5 feet from end to end, the upper part of her body would have been pushed up the sloping head of the bath, far above the level of the water. The second stage consists of violent spasms of the limbs, which were drawn up to the body and then flung outward. Therefore, no one of her size would possibly get under water, even when her muscles were relaxed. The bath was simply too small. Using Dr. French's description of Bessie Williams when he found her in the bath, Spilsbury reasoned that Smith must have seized her by the feet and suddenly pulled them up towards himself, sliding the upper part of the body under water. The sudden flood of water into her nose and throat might cause shock and sudden loss of consciousness, explaining the absence of injuries and minimal signs of drowning. Inspector Neal hired several experienced female divers of the same size and build as the victims. He tried to push them under water by force, but there would be inevitable signs of struggle. He then unexpectedly pulled the feet of one of the divers, and her head glided under water before she knew what happened. Suddenly he saw that the woman was no longer moving. He quickly pulled her out of the bath, and it took him and a doctor over half an hour to revive her. When she came to, she related that the only thing she remembered was the rush of water before she lost consciousness. So, Spilsbury's theory confirmed. George Smith was arrested on the 15th of February 1915 and formally charged on the 23rd of March with the murders of Bessie Williams, Alice Smith and Margaret Lloyd. The inevitable trial began on the 22nd of June 1915 at the Old Bailey in London. In accordance with English law at the time, he could be tried for only one killing, that of the murder of Bessie Munday, although the prosecution used the deaths of the other two to establish the pattern of Smith's crimes. You can only hang a man or woman once, hence the reason that only one murder was under consideration. Smith elected not to give evidence in his own defence, indicating this to Marshall Hall, his defence counsel, in a handwritten note. Whatever the circumstances surrounding the three deaths, it still did not make for a strong case against Smith. None of the bodies had any marks of violence, and Smith had first consulted doctors, showing illness on the part of his wives. The prosecution would rely on the eminent pathologist, Dr. Bernard Spilsbury, to prove their case, and, to some extent, the remarkable fact that in 3 consecutive cases, a newly married wife to the same man, twice using false names, had ended abruptly in death when taking a bath. Taking a bath in those days was not quite the same experience as today. First, it was not uncommon for baths not to be fitted with taps. They were filled with water from enamel buckets. And second, and significant in the deaths of Smith's 3 wives, the bathtubs were short and narrow. Having had the 3 deceased women exhumed, and ruled out suicide in any of their deaths, Spilsbury produced a theory which the police decided was enough to charge Smith with murder, which was a means of drowning someone in a bath where the victim would drown without a struggle. The bath used for the murder of Alice Burnham was produced, and the pathologist demonstrated how Smith had drowned his brides. Spilsbury's theory was that Smith would approach his new wife as she reclined in the bath. She would suspect nothing of his intention, as he stood over the bath and deftly slid an arm under her knees, or grabbed her ankles, and quickly lifted her legs, possibly giving her head a gentle push down with his free hand. Taken by surprise, she would immediately be submerged with water surging up her nose and into her mouth, which would choke her. It would then be a simple matter of holding her in position for a minute or so, with drowning the inevitable consequence. There would be no chance of her gripping the sides of the bath, whose narrow confines allowed no room for manoeuvre. Smith would then, so called, find his wife later, and be suitably shocked. Smith was competent of his acquittal, although he lost his temper at one point, telling the court that he had not committed murder, and could not be sentenced to death. The full extent of Smith's criminality and life of bigamy was revealed to the court. Edith Pegler was the only one of George Smith's many brides who he married in his real name, and he probably genuinely cared for her. He wrote her a letter days before his execution. Smith had flitted in and out of her life, disappearing for months on end, returning to her for a few weeks in between his other marriages, flush with cash. He explained his absences by claiming he was travelling for business. The two moved around England constantly throughout their time together. She testified for the prosecution at his trial. Recounting her lonely nomadic life, she was questioned extensively about the baths in their many homes and flats. It took the jury about 20 minutes on the 1st of July to find the accused guilty of murder, and the judge sentenced him to death. Smith was hanged in Maidstone Prison on the 13th of August by the hangman John Ellis. In an earlier statement to the police, Pegler had said, "Just after Christmas 1914, we were living in a flat at 10 Kennington Avenue in Bristol, and I said I was going to have a bath. He said, 'In that bath there, I should advise you to be careful of those things, as it is known that women have often lost their lives through weak hearts and fainting in the bath.'"